I watched as legitimate questions about election integrity, social media censorship, and government overreach were met not with reasoned responses, but with immediate attempts to silence and discredit anyone raising them. I found myself in the position of having factual information about certain events that contradicted official narratives, but sharing that information publicly would have triggered coordinated attacks on my businesses, my employees, and my family. The choice became speak truth and watch everything I've built be destroyed by mob tactics, or stay silent and watch America slide further away from the principles of open inquiry and free speech. This wasn't a sustainable position. When you reach the point where telling the truth becomes dangerous to your ability to continue productive work, something fundamental has broken in your society. I had access through my companies to data about information suppression, coordinated narrative control, and systematic efforts to prevent certain perspectives from reaching the public. What I saw wasn't just typical political maneuvering. It was industrial-scale manipulation of public discourse. I watched as federal agencies worked with social media platforms to suppress information that later proved to be accurate. I saw evidence of organized campaigns to destroy the credibility of scientists, doctors, and researchers who presented data that didn't support preferred narratives about everything from public health policies to economic impacts of government decisions. The coordination was extensive. Regular meetings between government officials and tech executives where lists of problematic content and users were discussed. Internal communications showing how certain topics were systematically deprioritized in algorithms, how shadow banning was implemented against specific users, how entire categories of information were marked for suppression regardless of their factual accuracy. Most disturbing, I witnessed how quickly institutions that were supposed to protect free inquiry, universities, media organizations, professional associations, became enforcers of orthodoxy rather than seekers of truth. The personal cost of speaking about these observations became clear when several of my business relationships were threatened simply because I questioned certain official positions. Partners who had worked with me for years suddenly became concerned about reputational risk associated with anyone who didn't conform completely to approved narratives. Major investors started asking questions about my political alignment during routine business meetings. Government contracts that my companies had been awarded were suddenly subject to additional review processes that seemed designed more to create pressure than to ensure compliance. The message was clear: conform to approved narratives or face systematic economic punishment. This wasn't happening through official government censorship. It was happening through a network of corporate, institutional, and social pressures that were arguably more effective than direct government control. I realized that the environment had become so toxic that honest inquiry was being treated as dangerous extremism. When you can't ask basic questions about government policies, when you can't examine data that contradicts official positions, when you can't even discuss alternative perspectives without facing professional and social destruction, you no longer live in a free society. This realization led me to understand that America was heading toward a form of soft totalitarianism, where dissent would be controlled not through direct government censorship, but through coordinated pressure from institutions, corporations, and social networks working together to enforce ideological conformity. The most chilling aspect was how many people seemed willing to participate in this system as long as it was targeting people they disagreed with politically. They couldn't see that the same mechanisms being used to silence their opponents could easily be turned against them when political winds shifted. After months of wrestling with these observations, I made a decision I never thought I would have to make. I decided to temporarily relocate my primary residence outside of America, not because I've given up on American ideals, but because I need space to continue advocating for those ideals without the constant threat of retaliation. This wasn't about running away from problems. It was about finding a position where I could continue working on solutions without being destroyed by the dysfunction itself. Sometimes you have to step outside a burning building to help put out the fire. The decision became clear when I realized that I was spending more time defending my right to speak freely than I was spending on the actual work of innovation and problem solving. The constant need to navigate political landmines, to carefully word every public statement to avoid triggering coordinated attacks, to manage the reputational risks that came with any form of independent thinking, this was consuming resources and mental energy that could be better used elsewhere. Let me tell you about someone who faced a similar choice under very different circumstances. Her name is Maria, and she's 72 years old. Maria emigrated to America from Eastern Europe in the 1960s, escaping a communist regime where speaking truth could cost you everything. She spent 50 years building a life in America, believing she had found a country where truth-telling was protected rather than punished. But in recent years, Maria started seeing patterns that reminded her of the country she had fled. The way certain questions became forbidden, the way people were encouraged to report on neighbors who expressed unapproved opinions, the way institutions that were supposed to protect freedom began enforcing conformity instead. I thought I had escaped this, Maria told me, but it's not about the political system, it's about the psychology. When people become more interested in controlling what others think than in finding out what's actually true, you get the same result whether you call it communism, fascism, or democracy. Maria's perspective was valuable because she had lived through the transition from a free society to an authoritarian one. She could see the early warning signs that people who had never experienced such transitions might miss. The most dangerous moment, she explained, is when good people convince themselves that suppressing uncomfortable truths is necessary for protecting important values. Once you accept that principle, there's no logical stopping point. Maria described how, in her home country, the transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with restrictions on hate speech and misinformation that most people supported because they seemed reasonable. It continued with professional consequences for people who expressed unpopular views. It escalated when questioning government policies became seen as unpatriotic or harmful to society. By the time people realized what was happening, the infrastructure for controlling thought and speech was already in place. Maria said, the same institutions that were supposed to protect freedom had been transformed into tools for suppressing it. Maria's observations helped me understand that what I was seeing in America wasn't just political polarization. It was the early stages of a systematic breakdown of the intellectual and cultural foundations that make free societies possible. But Maria also showed me something hopeful. She had found ways to maintain her commitment to truth and freedom even under difficult circumstances. She had built networks of like-minded people who supported each other when official institutions failed them. She had learned to work around systems of control without directly confronting them in ways that would be self-destructive. You have to be strategic, she told me. Direct confrontation often just gives them excuses to crack down harder. But if you're smart about it, you can preserve spaces for truth-telling and free inquiry even when the official culture is hostile to those things. The decision to temporarily relocate wasn't about abandoning America or giving up on American principles. It was about finding a position where I could continue defending those principles more effectively, using strategies that Maria and others had taught me about, working for freedom from positions of tactical safety. From outside the immediate pressure and chaos, I can see more clearly what's happening and develop strategies for addressing it. I can speak more freely about what I've observed without putting my employees and partners at risk. I can work on solutions without spending all my energy defending against attacks. The companies I've built continue to employ thousands of Americans and contribute to American technological leadership. The physical distance is temporary and strategic, not permanent and emotional. But this experience has taught me something important about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and resources. When you see fundamental threats to the principles that make progress possible, you can't just hope someone else will address them. You have to be willing to take risks to preserve the conditions that allow innovation and truth-seeking to flourish. This responsibility extends to everyone who values truth over conformity, who believes in free inquiry over enforced orthodoxy, who understands that real progress requires the ability to question assumptions and challenge narratives. You don't have to have my resources or platform to make a difference. You just have to be willing to speak honestly about what you observe, to ask questions even when asking them is discouraged, to maintain your commitment to truth even when truth becomes unpopular. The older Americans in my audience understand this particularly well. You've lived long enough to see how quickly societies can change direction, how institutions can be captured by ideological movements, how freedoms can be lost gradually through the accumulation of small compromises. Your experience gives you perspective that younger people often lack. You understand that the freedoms we take for granted aren't permanent features of American life. They're achievements that must be actively maintained by each generation. You also understand that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is resist the current direction of your country's institutions when those institutions have lost sight of the principles they're supposed to serve. This understanding is particularly important because the current crisis in American discourse affects everyone, but it hits people with historical memory especially hard. When you've lived through periods when Americans could disagree politically while still maintaining respect for basic principles of open inquiry, it's particularly painful to watch those principles being abandoned. Many older Americans I've spoken with express frustration that their perspectives are being dismissed not because of the merit of their arguments, but because they're seen as representing outdated ways of thinking. They're watching institutions they trusted and supported for decades transform into something they no longer recognize. Your voices are being systematically marginalized, often under the guise of making room for fresh perspectives or new approaches. But what's really happening is the dismissal of inconvenient historical knowledge and hard-won wisdom about what works and what doesn't in human societies. When a 75-year-old economist who lived through multiple boom-bust cycles warns about the consequences of certain financial policies, they're dismissed as not understanding modern economics. When a retired teacher who spent 40 years in classrooms raises concerns about new educational approaches, they're told they don't understand how children learn today. This systematic devaluation of experience and historical knowledge is part of the same authoritarian impulse that seeks to control discourse more broadly. Societies that are committed to learning from experience value the perspectives of people who have actually lived through the consequences of different approaches. But societies that are more interested in implementing ideological agendas than in learning what works tend to dismiss such perspectives as irrelevant or harmful. They prefer to work with people who have strong theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience with the long-term consequences of different policies and approaches. The question isn't whether America will face challenges to its founding principles. Those challenges are already here. The question is whether enough people will recognize what's happening and take action to preserve the intellectual and cultural foundations that make freedom possible. My temporary relocation is one person's response to this challenge. But the real solution requires millions of Americans choosing truth over comfort, principle over popularity, long-term thinking over short-term advantage. The goal isn't to escape from American problems, but to approach them with renewed energy and clearer perspectives. Sometimes you have to step outside a system to understand how to fix it. What I've learned during this time is that America's current dysfunction isn't inevitable or permanent. Other democracies have faced similar challenges and found ways to preserve open discourse and free inquiry even during periods of intense political pressure. But recovery requires people who are willing to prioritize truth over tribal loyalty, who can see beyond immediate political battles to longer-term questions about what kind of society we want to build and maintain. The battle for America's future isn't being fought on traditional political battlefields. It's being fought in every conversation where someone chooses truth over convenience, in every moment when someone asks a difficult question instead of accepting a comfortable lie, in every situation where someone stands up for principle, even when it costs them something. You have more power in this battle than you might realize. Your voice, your example, your willingness to speak honestly about what you observe, these matter more than you know. The older Americans reading this have a crucial role to play. Your historical memory provides context for understanding what's at stake. Your life experience gives you credibility when speaking about long-term consequences. Your relative freedom from career pressures allows you to take positions that younger people might find professionally risky. Most importantly, your commitment to the principles that made America great can provide stability and continuity during a period when those principles are under attack. This is why I'm sharing this decision with you, not because I want to encourage others to leave, but because I want to encourage others to stay and fight for the principles that make America worth defending. The temporary distance I've created isn't just about protecting myself, it's about gaining the perspective needed to help others understand what we're fighting for and why it matters. The principles of free inquiry, open debate, and respect for experience that built America are worth preserving. But they won't preserve themselves. They require active defense from people who understand their value and are willing to take risks to maintain them. The question is whether enough Americans, especially those with the wisdom and perspective that comes with age, are ready to take on that responsibility. I believe the answer is yes, but only if we're honest about what that responsibility entails. It's not enough to complain about what's happening or to hope that someone else will fix the problems we're facing. It requires individual courage to speak truth in your own circles, even when that truth is unpopular. It requires supporting people who are being punished for asking legitimate questions, even when supporting them might be costly for you. It requires refusing to participate in the mob dynamics that are destroying public discourse, even when the mob is targeting people you don't like or agree with. It requires maintaining your commitment to principles like due process, evidence-based reasoning, and charitable interpretation of others' motives, even when abandoning those principles would give you tactical advantages in political battles. Most importantly, it requires understanding that the fight for American principles isn't about winning immediate political victories. It's about preserving the cultural and intellectual infrastructure that makes democratic self-governance possible over the long term. This kind of thinking comes naturally to people who have lived long enough to see how short-term political wins can create long-term systemic problems. Your generation built the prosperity and freedoms that younger Americans are now taking for granted. You understand what it took to create these achievements and what it will take to preserve them. She took one look at me and called an ambulance. I tried to tell her I was fine, that I just needed a minute, but the words came out slurred and confused. I remember feeling embarrassed more than scared. Here I was, someone who prides himself on being in control, and I couldn't even speak clearly or sit up straight. Part of me was still thinking about the meetings I was supposed to have that afternoon, worried about disappointing people. The paramedics arrived and immediately started checking my vital signs. My blood pressure was dangerously high, 180 over 120. My heart rate was erratic, jumping between racing and skipping beats. They said I was showing signs of severe exhaustion and stress-related complications that could lead to a heart attack or stroke. One of the paramedics, a woman probably in her 50s, looked me in the eye and said, "Sir, your body is in crisis mode. We need to get you to the hospital immediately." That's when reality hit me. I wasn't invincible. I wasn't immune to the consequences of treating my body like a machine that could run indefinitely without maintenance. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, I kept drifting in and out of consciousness. All I could think about was how stupid I'd been. Here I am, always talking about the importance of taking care of things, maintaining equipment, following safety protocols, planning for the long term. But I'd completely ignored those same principles when it came to my own health. I thought about my children, about all the things I still wanted to do with them. I thought about the people who depended on me, not just professionally but personally. What if this had been worse? What if I'd had a heart attack at my desk and died because I was too stubborn to take care of myself? The emergency room was a blur of tests and questions. Blood work, heart monitoring, brain scans to make sure I hadn't had a stroke. The medical team moved with the kind of urgency that made me realize how serious this was. The doctor who examined me was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she was brutally honest in a way that probably saved my life. "Mr. Musk," she said, "your body is shutting down. Your cortisol levels are through the roof. Your blood work shows you're severely dehydrated and malnourished. When was the last time you had a real meal or a full night's sleep?" I couldn't remember. That's how bad it had gotten. She pulled up my test results on her tablet and showed me numbers that meant nothing to me but clearly alarmed her. "Your stress hormone levels are similar to what we see in soldiers coming back from combat zones. Your body thinks it's been under constant threat for months." Dr. Chen told me I was experiencing what's called acute stress reaction. Basically, my body's way of forcing me to stop before something worse happened. She said if I'd continued the way I was going, I could have had a heart attack or stroke within weeks. "You're 53 years old," she said. "Your body isn't 25 anymore. The recovery time from stress and sleep deprivation gets longer as you age. You can't keep running it into the ground and expect it to keep working." That hit me harder than any business failure ever had. She explained something that nobody had ever told me clearly before. "Stress isn't just feeling overwhelmed," she said. It's a physical process that affects every organ in your body. When you're constantly stressed, your body produces hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that are meant to help you handle short-term emergencies. Dr. Chen drew a simple diagram showing how chronic stress affects the body. But when those stress hormones stay elevated for months, they start damaging your heart, your blood vessels, your immune system, your digestive system, even your brain. You become more prone to infections, injuries, depression, anxiety, and serious cardiovascular problems. She told me that people my age who maintain chronic high stress levels have significantly higher rates of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and early death. Think of it like running your car engine in the red zone. She said, you might get more speed temporarily, but you're destroying the engine. Eventually, it's going to break down completely. That analogy made sense to me in a way that all the previous warnings about work-life balance never had. I spent 3 days in the hospital. 3 days of forced rest, IV fluids to rehydrate me, proper meals brought on schedule, and a lot of time to think about what had brought me to that point. The first night was the hardest. I kept wanting to check my phone, to respond to messages, to stay connected to everything that seemed urgent. But the nurses had strict orders: no work, no stress, complete rest. By the second day, something strange started happening. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. I could think about problems without feeling panicked. I could have conversations without constantly checking the time or thinking about what I needed to do next. It was like I'd been living in a fog of exhaustion and stress for so long that I'd forgotten what normal felt like. During my stay, I started talking to other patients and hospital staff about stress and overwork. What I discovered surprised me. Almost everyone had a story about pushing too hard and paying the price, sometimes a minor price like constant exhaustion or frequent illnesses, sometimes a major price like heart attacks, strokes, or severe depression. My roommate was a 62-year-old man named Frank who'd had a mild heart attack. He told me he'd been working 60-hour weeks for years as an accountant, convinced that he couldn't slow down until he retired. The funny thing is, Frank said, I thought I was being responsible by working so hard. I was providing for my family, building up savings for retirement. But what I was really doing was gambling with the years I'd have to enjoy retirement. Frank's heart attack had happened during tax season, his busiest time of year. He'd been working 16-hour days for 2 months, eating fast food at his desk, and sleeping 4 hours a night. My wife kept telling me to slow down, he said. My kids kept asking me to come to their games and concerts. I kept saying after tax season or after we finish this big project, but there was always another busy season, another big project. The morning of his heart attack, Frank had felt chest pain but ignored it because he had client deadlines. It wasn't until the pain became unbearable that he finally went to the hospital. Now I'm looking at months of recovery and cardiac rehabilitation. He said, all those extra hours I worked, they don't matter now. My clients found other accountants. The world didn't end because I wasn't available, but my health almost did. I also met a nurse named Patricia who'd been working in the cardiac unit for 20 years. She told me that the majority of heart attack patients she sees are people between 50 and 65 who've been under chronic work stress. They all say the same thing, Patricia told me. I thought I could handle it. I thought I was tougher than that. I thought I had time to take care of my health later. She said that many of these patients are successful people, executives, doctors, lawyers, small business owners, who've been rewarded their whole careers for working harder than everyone else. The problem is that the same drive that makes people successful can also kill them if they don't learn to manage it. Patricia explained, your body doesn't care how important your work is. It has limits, and when you exceed those limits consistently, it breaks down. Patricia shared something that really stuck with me. She said that the patients who recover best aren't necessarily the youngest or the healthiest. They're the ones who use their health scare as a wake-up call to change their entire approach to life. The patients who go right back to their old habits usually end up back here within a year or two, she said. But the ones who really change, who learn to prioritize their health, who set boundaries around work, who invest in relationships and hobbies, they often tell me later that their heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to them. During my second day in the hospital, Dr. Chen brought in a cardiologist to explain the long-term risks I was facing if I didn't change my lifestyle. Dr. Rodriguez was probably in his 60s, and he spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen too many preventable tragedies. The human body is remarkably resilient, he said, but it's not infinitely resilient. Every day of chronic stress, poor sleep, and inadequate nutrition creates small amounts of damage throughout your system. Usually, that damage accumulates slowly and invisibly until suddenly it reaches a tipping point. He showed me charts of what happens to the cardiovascular system under chronic stress. Blood pressure rises, arteries become inflamed, the heart works harder to pump blood through constricted vessels. Over time, this leads to heart disease, stroke, and organ failure. The good news, Dr. Rodriguez said, is that much of this damage is reversible if you make changes now. The bad news is that if you don't make changes, you're likely looking at serious cardiovascular events within the next few years. He told me about patients he'd treated who ignored warning signs like mine. Some had heart attacks in their 50s. Others had strokes that left them permanently disabled. Still others developed diabetes or other chronic conditions that dramatically reduced their quality of life. The tragedy, he said, is that most of these problems are preventable with lifestyle changes that aren't even that difficult. But people wait until they have a major health crisis to make those changes, and by then it's often too late to prevent serious damage. On my third day in the hospital, I had a conversation that changed my perspective completely. Dr. Chen brought in a man named Robert, who was 78 years old and had experienced almost exactly what I was going through, but 23 years earlier. Robert looked incredible for his age, energetic, clear-eyed, moving with the confidence of someone much younger. He told me he'd been a workaholic executive who'd collapsed from stress and exhaustion at 55. I was just like you, he said. Thought I was invincible. Thought taking care of my health was something I could do later, after I finished building my career and providing for my family. Robert's collapse had been even more severe than mine. He'd actually had a mild heart attack and spent a week in intensive care. His doctors told him that if he didn't make dramatic changes, he probably wouldn't live to see 60. That was my wake-up call, he said. I realized I'd been so focused on building a successful life that I'd forgotten to actually live it. Robert made radical changes. He reduced his work hours, started exercising daily, learned to cook healthy meals, and began prioritizing sleep. He also started focusing on relationships and hobbies that brought him joy rather than just achievement. The amazing thing, he said, is that my work actually improved when I started taking care of my health. I had more energy, better focus, clearer thinking. I made better decisions because I wasn't constantly operating in crisis mode. Robert had been retired for 13 years, but was still active and healthy. He volunteered, traveled with his wife, spent time with his grandchildren, and pursued interests he'd never had time for during his workaholic years. I've had 23 extra years that I wouldn't have had if I'd continued on the path I was on, he said. 23 years of good health, good relationships, and genuine happiness. That heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to learn what really matters. Robert's story gave me hope, but it also made me realize how much time I'd already wasted ignoring my health. How many years had I spent being less effective than I could have been because I was constantly exhausted? How many moments with family and friends had I missed because I was too stressed and distracted to be present? I also met Margaret, a 67-year-old woman who'd been visiting her husband in the cardiac unit. She told me that she'd learned to prioritize her health after watching several friends and family members suffer serious health consequences from chronic stress. I decided I wasn't going to wait for a crisis to make changes, she said. I saw what happened to people who ignored their health, and I decided to be proactive instead of reactive. Margaret had developed what she called her non-negotiable health habits. She treated exercise, proper nutrition, and adequate sleep like any other important commitment, scheduled and protected. I schedule my exercise, my meals, and my sleep, just like I schedule meetings, she said. They're not optional. They're not things I do if I have extra time. They're the foundation that makes everything else possible. Margaret explained that treating health as a priority rather than an afterthought had actually made her more productive and successful in other areas of life. When I'm well rested and healthy, I can accomplish more in 6 focused hours than I used to accomplish in 10 exhausted hours. She also talked about how prioritizing her health had improved her relationships. When I'm not constantly stressed and tired, I'm more patient with people. I listen better. I'm more present for the people I care about. These conversations made me realize that my hospital stay wasn't just about me. It was about the example I set for other people, especially younger people, who might think that sacrificing health for success is admirable or necessary. It's not admirable, it's not necessary, and it's not sustainable. On my last day in the hospital, Dr. Chen gave me a comprehensive plan for recovery and prevention. But before she talked about diet and exercise and medication, she talked about mindset. The biggest challenge you'll face, she said, isn't following a diet or exercise program. It's changing the beliefs that got you here in the first place. She explained that many high-achieving people have what she called martyrdom thinking, the belief that suffering for work makes you more valuable, that sacrificing your health proves your dedication, that taking care of yourself is selfish or weak. You need to understand that taking care of your health isn't selfish, Dr. Chen said. It's responsible. It's how you ensure that you'll be able to contribute for the long term rather than burning out early. She gave me a different way to think about health maintenance. Think of it as an investment, not an expense. The time and energy you put into staying healthy will be returned to you multiplied in better performance, clearer thinking, more energy, and more years of productive life. Dr. Chen also talked about the ripple effects of health choices. When you take care of your health, you're not just helping yourself. You're reducing the burden on your family, you're modeling good behaviors for younger people, you're ensuring you'll be available for people who depend on you. Since leaving the hospital, I've made changes that I should have made years ago, but I want to be honest about how difficult it's been. Changing lifelong habits isn't easy, especially when those habits have been rewarded professionally and socially. The first change was sleep. I committed to sleeping 7 hours a night, no exceptions. This meant saying no to some late-night meetings and social events. It meant setting boundaries that felt uncomfortable at first. But the difference was almost immediate. After just 1 week of proper sleep, my thinking was clearer, my patience was better, and my energy was more consistent throughout the day. The second change was nutrition. Instead of surviving on coffee, snacks, and whatever was available in meetings, I started eating 3 real meals a day. I hired someone to help with meal planning and preparation because I knew I wouldn't maintain this change if it was complicated or time-consuming. The improvement in my energy and mood was remarkable. I hadn't realized how much my erratic eating patterns were affecting my mental clarity and emotional stability. The third change was exercise. I started with just 30 minutes of walking every morning. Nothing intense, nothing that required special equipment or gym memberships. Just a simple walk outside before starting work. This became my favorite part of the day. 30 minutes of quiet time to think, to notice the world around me, to transition from sleep to work in a healthy way. It gave me more energy for the rest of the day and helped me sleep better at night. The fourth change was boundaries. I stopped checking email after 8 p.m. and before 8 a.m. I blocked out time during the day for focused work without interruptions. I learned to delegate more effectively instead of trying to handle everything myself. These boundaries felt scary at first. I worried that people would think I was lazy or uncommitted, but the opposite happened. When I was more rested and focused during my working hours, I was actually more effective and valuable to the people I work with. The most surprising change was in my relationships. When I wasn't constantly exhausted and stressed, I became more patient, more present, and more enjoyable to be around. My conversations with family and friends became deeper and more meaningful because I had the mental and emotional energy to really engage. But I want to be honest about the challenges too. There are still days when I'm tempted to skip exercise or stay up late working on something that seems urgent. There are still times when I feel guilty for taking time to eat a proper meal or take a walk. Take care of yourself with the same attention and commitment you give to other important things in